Om. 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 Om Tat Sat. Om Satyanandam. Om Paravak Shakti. Om, God alone exists. God alone is reality. Om, the 26th live stream teaching of SATYAVEDISM. Om, God manifesting and negative hypnotic spell-ing language. Lssv 26. Om. 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 So this teaching is about God manifesting and the effects of negative hypnotic spell-ing language. Om. So in order to truly God manifest clearly, without any pollutioning or superimpositioning of ignorance in the seeming way, one of the most important aspects of ignorance that needs to be cleared is any negativity. Quote unquote negativity, as it is usually spoken of in the dreaming, in the fiction. Because if that is not cleared, then the God manifesting will be detrimental, as can be seen in the dreaming. So direct God manifesting involves removing that ignorance. But in order to begin to seemingly remove the ignorance, there has to be understanding of the various sorts and types of ignorant phenomenon, of what is called negativity. It has to be seen through and then cleared. In God realization, there is no negative thought phenomenon. All of it gets dropped. It's cleared and dropped. And then God reality is seen for what it truly is. So step seeming one of God manifesting is to remove the negativity. Now, that is the only reason that all of the negativity is being addressed and spoken of. Because in the God transcension, there will not be any need to even reference that sort of seeming negativity. It will have already been transcended. But in order to seeming transcend it, there needs to be clear seeing of it. And so this teaching addresses, as such, that ignorance in order to truly God manifest as God. So in order for there to be God manifesting, there has to be discarding of all thoughts of negativity and associated limitationing of what would be considered small thought, fictional content of assertion of limitations that do not actually exist in God reality. So in this seeming transitioning to what would be called the Satyuga, the age of truth, it is not actually referencing a time frame, because time does not exist in God reality. But it is referencing, there is referencing to a transition or an evolutioning of God phenomenon. And that transitioning into the what is called the God happening of the Satyuga Om, from what would be called the Kali Yuga, which is basically the pinnacle of God ignorance of reality, and that transforming into God truth reality. So the seeming Satyuga has already seemingly started in eternity, but there is still a lot of what would be considered pollutioning, still phenomening from what is called the Kali Yuga-ing. And it needs to be cleared in order for the full transition of the God transcension of Satya Yuga to prevail. So the Kali Yuga paradigm structuring seemingly is full of conflict that has not been resolved, and it recycles over and over and over again. And that is still to be seen playing out. And the God manifestation is to dissipate it, to break it up, and to dissolve it. So there's all sorts of strife and conflict seemingly going on in the fictioning, in the species fiction, virtual reality. So all of this negativity is being addressed. Now, there have been ways of describing some of the most conflicting phenomena. Ways of describing it, such as demonic or evil, or in extreme cases, possession, demonic possession, etc. And there's a large seeming range of light to very dense ignorance as such. So the speaking of that makes it seemingly appear that those are actual entities, demons and devils and etc. and all that. But it's not. It is not like that. But the reconfiguring of that sort of ignorance that causes such hostilities is basically that what is called evil is divine ignorance, ignorance of divinity, of God truth. And it can get extremely convoluted, so convoluted and with such force seemingly at the back of it that it can seem like or appear in fiction to have some sort of entity-like behavioring. But in fact, there are no such entities. There is just processing. When the mechanics is seen through for what it is. So that what is called the slaying of imagined demons, or the exorcism of the ego, which is just the clearing of the pseudo-egoing phenomenon in reality within the dreaming. So it may appear that there needs to be slaying of demons or demonic forces, etc., in order to clear the ignorance or to dissipate it. But there is actually no violence occurring. This is actually the clearing of ignorance. By the dissemination of divine knowledge, and then direct realization of that divine knowledge. And then the seeming demonic forces cease. Seemingly, this is how it may appear. This is what it might look like, but that is not actually how it occurs. So it is to remove, to dissolve this ignorance, so that true divinity can be seen for what it is, and God whole reality can be realized. As it already is in eternity, in God eternity. All as it already has been, always. So as to the spelling of language, there are many uses of language. God in the happening of, God in the form of various languages and languaging. But language should reflect actual God reality and not speak directly of ignorance from seeming ignorance. And this is what occurs, is that, for example, in the language which is said to be God in the form of English, the word spell can take on ambiguity. So when a seeming word is spelled, usually what occurs is that each seeming letter is spoken or written separately from seemingly the whole word itself. So they're spelling out a word, like the word the would be spelled T-H-E, spelled. So this takes on some ambiguity. To spell a word is to cast it out into God consciousness, from God consciousness. Because there are no divisions in God consciousness. So what seemingly might be a word thought from seemingly within and then cast outward, there is no distinction in God reality. It's all occurring in God consciousness with no separation. But the casting of that spell, the spelling of the word, each seeming word is a spell. Each seeming letters that make up a word are spelling it. Each seeming word, when combined with other words to make a seeming sentence, basically is a spell all as well. But the spell cast in that is that each individual word, instead of being an individual letter, is put together to make a complete spell sentence. And then the sentences, God in the form of the sentences, then are cast, each one as a spell, creating seeming paragraphs or continued thought. Now there really is not any linearity. But as the language is processing, there are associations that are made between the seeming words and between the seeming sentences, and then the thoughts that occur because of the hearing of those seeming sentences and words in God consciousness. So all of this is occurring and creates a spell, because it is hypnotizing, seemingly, unless there is witnessing otherwise and seeing through all this processing. It is hypnotizing. It is casting a spell. Now there are to be subsequent teachings that go into how language is activated, God activated, in God consciousness. And those teachings are to explicitly speak of the actual mechanics of the activation. But in this teaching, this is being kept to specifically to the spell casting like qualities of language. Now this seeming spell is not just occurring to seemingly what would be another, that they're speaking of one seeming body to another, so the spell is being cast to another. It is being cast to the seeming one that seems to be projectioning out the spell, because there is no separation. So it appears that way in the dreaming, but in fact there is no separation. So the spell is equally casting and hypnotizing the seeming one casting it, because in God consciousness there is no separation. So what seems to be said from one to another is being said to the one that is trying to say it to the other as well, in unison, all one, exactly happening at once. So whatever content is being transmitted, seemingly, is received all in God consciousness, not just one consciousness. There is no such thing as individual consciousness. So it's not transmitted from one consciousness to another consciousness. It's transmitted in God consciousness. So transmitting and receiving, in effect, becomes the same. Because what appears to be transmitted is received at once. Oh. So the spell that is cast affects seemingly God Omni. So if that seeming spell, that linguistic spell, seems to be of a, quote, negative nature, or conflictive nature, or hostile nature, etc., all the various emotions and thought content that are subsequently to be delineated, enumerated as well. That negative linguistic spellcasting has effects. It has effects in God consciousness. It has effects on the seeming God in the form of the seeming bodies. It has all sorts of effects. Endless effects. Because effects do not stop. Effects reverberate through God Omni. So in God realization, there has to be the breaking of that spell. The hypnotic spell, spelling of languaging. The breaking of that spell. The dehypnotizing. The hypnotic spell has to be broken. Now, some of the seeming use of language, again, unbeknownst seemingly to God in the pseudo-egoing. And again, the pseudo-egoing is a form of linguistic spell. There are all sorts of ways to perceive and to see through the processing, the actual mechanics of how the pseudo-egoing becomes believed into the belief that it is an entity unto itself as a person and associated with a body. Because the spell casting of the language is so hypnotic that it continues the believing for seeming years and years in eternity that do not actually exist. The believing that there are years and that there's some linearity to all the seeming years continuing one after another, creating a seeming timeline that does not actually exist, and the years do not actually exist. And all of this is because of the belief in the language, the thought content that has been the programming, the species fiction programming. And all of this goes on and on and on without actually seeing through the mechanics of it to the real, and to the realization that that is not the true self. And that is not the true self of seeming others that do not actually exist as individuals. So if there is what is called self-realization, then that has to be extended out. It does not a self-realization of an entity, of a separate self. There is no individual soul. There are no individual souls. So it cannot be extrapolated. For instance, the use of what is called namaste, a word, a spell, the spell of the word namaste can easily be misunderstood as saying the individual consciousness in me, quote, the body or whatever, is the same as the individual consciousness in that other body, that it is the same. But that is a misunderstanding of what namaste spell would mean. So that has to be being able to see through all of that as well, even the spiritual spelling. But that is not the actual meaning of the word namaste in any case. The true meaning is that God consciousness is in all and has no borders. And it seems that the body appearance is permeated by that God consciousness as well, but it is not limited. So, etc. Those various spells as well. Spells being basically a belief in a concept, and then various concepts strung together. So thought content is extremely important. There cannot be any self-realization or God realization and then continued belief in thought content that is fictional. There can be flashes of self-realization or God realization, but there are flashes of it. But then when there's belief, when there's back to regular scheduled programming of thinking that there are species bodies, and that there is the seeming continuing of as normal functioning, then there is no true self-realization. There is no true God realization if that is still going on. So the spell of hypnosis has to completely be broken. So that is why language is so primarily important in true self-realization and true God realization. To continue to see the believing of the thought content that has been disseminated in the species fiction virtual reality is not true realization. So the language is primary in the language evolving for the spell casting to cease. So there has to be breaking of the spell, and primarily many of the seeming spells are negative, limiting, but not actually. But the content asserts much negativity and limitations that are not real. So there is no effect, however, if there is no allowance, or if if the wording is not believed. There's no allowance or beliefing. So for instance, no one can do anything to anyone else, linguistically, with language, unless it is allowed or believed. If it is not allowed or believed, then nothing is being done by anyone else. And even if it is allowed and believed, it is still not being done by someone else. Someone else is not doing anything to seeming you. So there cannot be any blame or assigning of blame. Or complaint. To be continued here. In God reality, that is an impossibility. That someone is doing something to someone else linguistically. All of the language is occurring in seamless God consciousness. So language can have no effect if it is not allowed or believed. Or believed that it is seemingly coming from somewhere else. And being intrusive, which is not occurring. So now to address conflict, which is so seemingly prevalent in the dreaming in fiction, in the species fiction, in the species virtual reality. Conflict. Seemingly unavoidable. Seemingly almost a sport. But nevertheless imaginary. So conflict is not normal, quote unquote. It is not normal. Whatever normal means. It has been seemingly normalized in fiction because it is so prevalent. It's like linguistic disease that affects seeming bodies, unfortunately. And so it must be cured. So it is not seeming normal in God reality, and is indicative of illness, of sickness. No matter how seemingly normalized it appears to be. It is illness and sickness. There does not need to be conflict. It is imagined, and it perpetuates as imagined. All the aggressiveness and defensiveness, seemingly. And then the counter to that, and the counter of defensiveness becoming aggressiveness, and that never-ending seeming cycle that does not have to continue. It does not have to perpetuate, because it is unreal. And it seems to be turns to nightmares in the dreaming, but it can easily be remedied. And this is exacerbated by the great phenomenon of God Intel Tech, technology, intelligence, of God in the form of the internet. Om. It's as great as the seeming God in the form of the internet has caused great God evolutioning, and the seeming bringing together of God speaking to God about God. It has also released a torrent of conflicting phenomenon of opinion fantasies in the fiction. All of this conflicting phenomenon that seems endless and much leads to much argumentation and all sorts of negative ramifications that occur when all the seeming opinions based on pretty much nothing in God actuality, that all the seeming opinions are basically dream opinions and as thought content, and it's all believed, and all of the seeming opinions may be conflicting due to whatever programming seems to have been occurring, and that all of that programming is not necessarily going to harmonize, to say the least. So there's there's much conflict that is internet, God in the form of internet driven outward into in the virtual reality. So the primary aspects of that basically are: one, judgment, and two, assertion of limitations. So God in the happening of what is called judgment within the dreaming. So basically what would be considered based on preconceived concepts, notions, projectionings, pollution density, various programmings basically of all fiction-fed content, reconfiguring, reverberating endlessly. So judgment is divine ignorance, period. It's ignorance of God reality, which is that there are no individuals and there are no individual opinions. So judgment's based on information about individual timelines, individual lives, individual actions, individual agency of individual bodies, individual intent, etc. All that information basically is untrue. It's just it's fiction in the true sense of the word fiction. Most of it, because most of it does not describe raw God phenomenological eventing. Which would be God truth, God manifestation truth. The raw God phenomenological eventing is true God manifestation, God manifesting. But all the judgment about individual seeming bodies and individual seeming within an individual seeming species and all that fixation on all of that actioning is basically a bunch of nonsense. So that's pollution, density, ignorance. And then two, limitation, or assertion of limitations. Basically that this is a seeming species body and with certain roles and all that, and all of that's associated with all that, basically. Anything that makes small of something that is unlimited. that is so large as to be beyond large, that is capable of is omnipotent, is God omnipotent. So those feelings of limitation, of reducing to a form, a lot of conflicting going on in regard to assertion of limitation. Assertion of limitation of seemingly oneself as a body, assertion of limitation of seemingly others as other bodies, and all of it is not true. So those are primary in the conflicting, is the judgment of seeming other bodies, of one's own seeming body that does not exist as a separation and is not associated with the true God self, and the limitation, the seeming assertion of limitations that are not true of bodies of other, of one's seeming body that is not one's self, and the misidentification with other bodies that are not those other selves, because there are no other selves and there are no other, and there is no separation of bodies, etc. In other words, it's all just real, not understanding God reality. But those are two main components of that: judgment and assertion of limitations for what phenomenaling as what is called negativity and conflict, etc. So there is no one that's actually at any fault. It's no one's fault. And it's not the system's fault. The system is not an entity. It is not to blame. There is no such thing as a system, as a separation of all that's conceptual. It's not reality. So there is no individual assigning of agency to blame as having a fault. It's no system's fault. It's not, there's nothing that can be pointed to as having, as being able to take the blame or be the problem. All that is imagined. So all this conflict about the fault of this or the fault of that one, or the fault of that not working properly, or the fault of endless fault finding, blaming, is not being in touch with reality of God's self and God manifestation. And again, it's not about waking up, because God is already awake always. It's about removing, clearing the ignorance, clearing the pollution, clearing all the thought content that is not real, that is not about reality. That has to be cleared, and then it becomes more and more obvious what the true self is, and what is just a... This is why the language is so important, because the language is a delivery of the information that causes all the most of the ignorance. And it is that seeming potent, if it's believed. So there's no individual agency assigning. Of course, absolute freedom of speech is very important regardless. This is not about banning negative, conflictive speech and getting rid of it in that way. Because in the dreaming, that causes all sorts of problems. About taking away a freedom that doesn't actually exist. It doesn't actually exist. Not in that way. There's no such thing as freedom in the dreaming, as long as there's feeling of being an entity or others being entities. There's no actual real freedom in the dreaming. The freedom is God absolute. of being God absolute. That is absolute freedom. So, but there is still that there should be absolute freedom of speech regardless, as long as there's believing in the dreaming, so that there won't be conflict about having it taken away and then have wars launched because of not having freedom of speech to speak fiction. Because that is what it is in reality. Freedom of speech to speak fiction. But nevertheless, there is freedom of speech to speak God truth as well. And this is what is occurring as God, not as a seeming individual species form. Again, I am not of a species. I am not this body. I am God, unlimited, unbound, no limitations whatsoever. So there has to be the clearing of any assertion of limitations, but that does not mean that there has to be the banning of speech and treading on the absolute freedom of speech to speak fiction, which also includes speaking God truth. So, but it is about not believing the fiction, regardless of how it's spoken, how free it may appear to be. Now, the negative speech primarily is of body consciousness, because it's not directly realized that this is God consciousness. So there's a misidentification with the body, and there's a misidentification of other seeming bodies as being spoken to, as being spoken about, etc. But that's not what's actually in reality being that is not in reality what God, speaking to directly God, about direct God, would truly mean. So there's in the dreaming, this is body consciousness, not direct realization of God consciousness. So the body consciousness is about, there's a lot of negative speech, quote, negative speech, negative thought, negative emotion, negative action. Because when there's belief in the negative speech, etc., there are ramifications of that, and that leads to action that may be detrimental, and usually is detrimental to the body functioning, health, etc., and other seeming bodies. So the negative speech, basically, some components are general negativity. Again, there really is no such thing as positive and negative. But in order to convey this and to use God speaking other words in the fictioning that are in some way identifiable. And then again, with the God transcension, all of this need not even be addressed at some point subsequently in eternity. And it will be quite refreshing. But until seeming then, in eternity, because there is no time, there's general negativity, such eventing as paranoia, criticism of seeming other bodies and rebuking, gossiping of other bodies and all the various seeming lives that in reality have no timeline, but somehow or other are cited as having events and instances, etc. Conflict, endless conflict, and debate, primarily debating fiction, its veracity, the veracity of the various perspectivings, creating the conflict and debating all basically about fiction, about the dream, debating about dreaming. And what veracity is there? What truth is there in that dreaming? Very little. So it seems, when seen through, and in God realization, it seems so pointless that so much seeming God energy is seemingly wasted on such activities. But of course, this is all because of the God evolutioning, because that is how the God evolutioning works. So it all is seemingly necessary, even though it appears to be so, it appears to be such a waste of God energy, but it is not. And then there is the complaining and blaming, which seems to be a great sport in dreaming. Just endlessly trying to assign blame. And then there is such a activity in thought currents of what would be called countering that, and called taking responsibility for one's actions. So there's no longer the evolution in dreaming, and what would be called shadow work, is to stop complaining and stop blaming, and to take responsibility for one's actions, take it upon oneself, and then at least there is less negativity and more self-assertion and assertion of self-power, empowerment, or whatever. And already this has been spoken in the teachings, that there is no such thing as self-assertion. There is no such thing as a self taking responsibility. So to cease the complaining and the blaming, along with all the rest, the negativity and the paranoia and the conflict and debating and all that, but to cease the particular sport, thought content sport of complaining and blaming, and all the associated illness that goes with that, to take a better seeming stance in the dreaming, the shadowing, is to have a positive outlook and to take responsibility for oneself and all that. But all that is still dreaming as well, because positive assertions about an individual and individual powers and all that is still asserting the belief in a person and personal power, and that's still dreaming. So that is not an antidote. That is not the antidote to all of this negativity. Is to start to cultivate a positive outlook and a positive view, and affirming all the powers of an individual and all that self-speak, the counter to negative self-speak, quote unquote, of a person, and then the positive affirming self-speak, all of it's still dreaming. It doesn't matter. It's still dreaming. So to make the dream happier is not the goal, quote unquote, the goal, seemingly. It is to clear all that. So, but in any case, the complaint and the complaining and blaming is to be seen through as not being real, because there is nothing to complain about. There is no one to blame. There is no one to gossip about. There's no one to be paranoid that someone seemingly is doing something to someone else and sabotaging and all that. All of these seeming ridiculous ideas that cause seeming emotions, because most thought, basically the cause of emotions primarily is thought-based. Fictional content, thought-based. So when all of that gets removed, the emotions, the seeming emotions, for the most part, will cease. There are other triggers to seeming emotions that are not thought-based, but primarily the delivery is thought-based, and the emotion is then plays out